So if you want to talk about one of the stranger cult classics in the comic book industry, you'd be hard-pressed to find a better example than The Umbrella Academy. For those not aware of the series in question or have only heard about it through the show on Netflix, not a great representation of the book in my opinion before you ask. The Umbrella Academy is a comic series written in 2007 by Gerard Way, who some of you might know as the lead singer of My Chemical Romance, with art by Gabriel Ba. There's been a few volumes of the series released since its inception, but for the sake of simplicity and because each book examines a different theme rather than one continuous one, we're going to focus on the first volume, The Apocalypse Suite. It's an extremely strange but consistently imaginative story about 7 out of 43 children who were all born the same day to women who weren't pregnant when the day began. They are adopted by a mysterious billionaire inventor named Sir Reginald Hargreaves, who is also a space alien because, comics. He adopts these children because he believes that they all possess unique superhuman powers and will one day save the world. For the most part, he seems to be right, and the children each develop unique superhuman powers that allow them to form the Umbrella Academy. But while they definitely fit all the superhero tropes, there's something very distinct about this team that seems to predict their inevitable failings from the get-go. The fact that beyond the abilities they demonstrate, Hargreaves doesn't really seem to care about any of them in the slightest. He doesn't even give them any names. He only gives them numbers, with their actual names given to them by a laboratory-built mother designed to care for them for him. There's number 1, named Luther by his mother, aka Space Boy, the de facto leader of the group with super strength. There's number 2, Diego, aka the Kraken, who seems to be skilled with acrobatics and knives. There's number 3, Allison, aka the Rumor, who has the ability to change reality by saying what she wants to be true. Then there's number 4, Klaus, aka the Seance, who has the ability of levitation, telekinesis, and to channel the dead. Number 5, simply known as the Boy, can travel through time, but disappeared when he was 13 when he presumably traveled to the future and hasn't been seen since. Number 6, Ben, is called the Horror due to the tentacles that can form from his body, but he is long dead before the main crisis of the story. And lastly, there's number 7, Vanya, who is remarkable only in her unremarkability, in that she's the only one of them that seemingly doesn't have any powers, and would often be left to the sidelines with her father while the rest of her siblings engage in the superheroics. Her only skill, it seems, is that she's really good with the violin. During their early childhood, they seem to have the picture-perfect ideal of a superhero team, as they fight giant monuments come to life while facing ridiculously comic-booky villains. And once they save the day, Hargreaves gives them ice cream, and they all get a pat on the back for saving the day, ignoring the fact that all of these children are victims of parental abuse, not in a direct physical and emotional sense, but as a result of consistent neglect at the hands of their father, who cares about them only as far as he can improve their abilities and convince them to serve their purpose. Beyond that, he has little care for the personal, developmental, or emotional needs of the children under his care. Flash forward 20 years, everyone has fundamentally changed, and not for the better, with each of the 7 children showing their own reflection of the damage caused by Hargreaves' negligence. Luther has been left on an outpost on the moon with his entire body, except for his head, replaced with that of a giant gorilla. Luther has spent a majority of his life trying his best to fit the mold that Hargreaves wanted him to as team leader. He was the most devoted to his father's mission of saving the world, but because he spent so much of his life trying to appease a father who never really cared about him, he pays a heavy cost. Not just physically, but also emotionally and mentally. Because, due to the way he's been forced to change, he's completely unable to sympathize with or understand the people around him, despite how much he may want to. His life is the mission, and he can't convince himself to change that or else lose all purpose. Diego chose the rebellious route, fully indulging in his Batman-esque persona, the Kraken, as he skulks around the night fighting criminals and working in secret with his Commissioner Gordon-esque contact, Inspector Lupo. Of the siblings, he seems to be the one most embittered by his childhood, and is constantly at odds with the other members of his family, particularly Luther, who seems to frequently battle for dominance, as well as Vanya, where it's implied that he secretly had feelings for her that were never returned. Allison's life isn't doing much better, but in a much more traditional sense. She managed to escape her life as a superhero and even had a husband and daughter, Claire. But by the time we meet up with her as an adult, she's divorced with her husband getting everything, including custody. Allison seems to be the one who worked tirelessly to escape the hardships of her upbringing, but found that it wasn't so easy, dragging her back into the fold while destroying everything she worked for. Klaus has taken a bit of a different approach to coping, adopting the personality and mannerisms of a gothic hipster with traits of a shockingly functional drug user. Of the bunch, he's the one that seems surprisingly the most well-adjusted, all things considered. And that leaves Vanya. Vanya was the outcast of the group when she was a child and remains even more so as an adult. She's a violinist best known for writing a tell-all book about her time in the Umbrella Academy and why she chose to leave. Her lack of any notable superpowers kept her on the sidelines and, more importantly, ensured that she was ignored throughout her life, leaving her bitter and resentful of a family that, to this day, continues to ignore her presence at best and treat her like a burden at worst. Even after writing the book, none of the other family members ever bring it up, nor does it seem to bother anyone that it exists, further cementing just how irrelevant her existence appears to be in the grand scheme of the Umbrella Academy. Each of these family members wear their emotional and psychological scarring on their sleeves, not only hating their father and hold him rightfully responsible for their upbringing, but also holding an obvious yet unspoken resentment towards each other for not doing more to protect each other from him. Diego and Vanya seem to harbor this resentment the most. The former outwardly lashing out at Luthor and the rest of his family frequently as a way of overcompensating for the perceived failures of his siblings, and the latter retreating inward and away from her siblings entirely, feeling that her presence is neither noticed, acknowledged, or wanted in any meaningful way, with her only real companion over the years being their genetically modified talking chimp named Mr. Pogo. Yeah, this book is weird. This is a family not bonded by love or belonging, but made of tolerated existence and shared trauma. Their personalities and identities are so tied to their upbringing and their father's legacy that when he dies at the beginning of the book, it forces all the siblings to begin to either consciously or unconsciously confront this influence in their lives as they reunite for the funeral. The self-reflection is giving a ticking clock in the form of an unexpected return of the long-lost brother number 5, who, while still looking the same age he was when he left, is actually significantly older and more experienced than the rest of the Academy. He tells them all that the world will end in a few days, forcing the Umbrella Academy to reluctantly become a team once more to find out how and stop it. Unbeknownst to them, however, the source of the apocalypse comes from the one place they've neglected to look for 20 years, their sister, Vanya. While the rest of her siblings are off becoming a superhero team again and trying to stop the apocalypse, Vanya is given an offer by a self-aware group of obviously evil musicians called the Orchestra Vertimentin. They ask her to join their ranks to play what they call the Apocalypse Suite, which will, what else, cause the apocalypse. The conductor of the group tries to persuade her by implying that her father might have been wrong about her, but Vanya rejects the offer out of hand because, yeah, of course she would. Any sane person would. Her immediate response is to travel to her family for solace and to warn them, but her family is currently in the midst of a fight with a group of robots programmed to return should the Umbrella Academy reform. The encounter goes about as well as you'd expect, with Diego being the one to save her from an attack, but immediately follow up by berating her for leaving the family, or more specifically him, to begin with, disowning her in the process. Vanya's response seems to pretty much boil down to, you know what, screw him, and she decides to join the orchestra, after which the conductor reveals that not only does she have powers like her siblings, but she might actually be the most powerful of the bunch, and only needs to unlock it. The process to do so, however, proves to be extremely painful, driving her insane and transforming her into the white violin. From there, Vanya unleashes years of jealousy, bitterness, and repression as she unleashes her vengeance on her siblings and the world, starting by destroying her family home and killing her confidant, Pogo. Realizing the end of the world is going to come from their own sister, the Umbrella Academy rushes to stop her and save the world. However, their attempts to do so end badly, as Allison's throat is cut and Luthor races off to the hospital to save her. Diego attempts to kill her himself, but Vanya uses his feelings for her against him. Even the shockingly dangerous number 5 seems to be unable to get close enough to stop her. Everyone seems unable physically and mentally to actually be in a position to stop their most destructive family member, except for the most unlikely one, Klaus, who pretends to channel her dead father and uses her unresolved issues with Hargreaves to distract her by telling her just how small and useless she is. Diego attempts to reach out one last time by reminding Vanya that even though their father never loved any of them, it doesn't matter as long as someone does. Before he can see if this plea actually works, however, number 5 shoots her in the head, effectively stopping her path to Armageddon. Or so it would seem, because while they stopped the performance, they did not manage to prevent a giant chunk of the moon from breaking off due to sonic vibrations, leaving it hurtling towards the theater. But once again, the meteor is stopped by the most unlikely of heroes, Klaus, who manages to telekinetically lift their entire meteor, saving the world. After all is said and done, though, none of the remaining members of the Umbrella Academy really know what to say. They hitch a ride back to their destroyed home, remaining largely quiet the entire trip, Upon returning to their destroyed home, made even more so by the appearance of a crashed Eiffel Tower spaceship they fought in the beginning of the book. Have I mentioned this book is weird? Diego and Luther have one more calm and surprisingly civil conversation before Luther begins to make himself a sandwich. And that, of all places, is where the book decides to end. Now, in my opinion, even though the book uses continuously unusual imagery and ideas from the first page to the last, there is very little in the book that doesn't serve some kind of purpose. Except maybe for the kind of sort of incest thing, I'm still not sure how I feel about that. As such, how the characters are presented at the beginning and who ultimately end up saving the day all play a crucial role in answering the story's central question. What do you do with the damage caused by parental abuse? An important fact to know about this book is that it moves at a pretty brisk pace, largely because Gerard Way probably wasn't sure if he was going to make another one of these, so he wanted to cram in as many ideas as possible. As such, a good portion of the themes and the character traits present in the story is largely implied through the characters' interactions, objects in the background, and through various symbolism. But everything in this story all ties back to one central theme: the consequences of parental neglect and the struggles of breaking free from it. Through its unusual trappings and its visual presentation, the Umbrella Academy actually very cleverly demonstrates the many different ways the children raised under this abusive parentage can grow into adulthood. Just as a couple examples, Luther literally becomes his father's working monkey, or ape as the case may be, desperate to gain his approval by mindlessly pursuing his goals to the point where Luther has lost the ability to relate to anyone else in his life. Number 5 pushes himself away from the rest of his family entirely and is forced to grow up much faster than any of his siblings so he can guide them, albeit coldly, into saving each other from their own destruction. But his cynicism and altruism implies a deeply rooted resentment towards his siblings for not being able to properly fend for themselves. And then there's the most interesting case, Vanya, the case of emotional suppression. Vanya pushes all her insecurities and doubts created by a father that frequently called her useless and a failure, with no real way to cope with or let out these emotions in any significant way. And that's why she's the most dangerous sibling. Her unlocked superpowers in the story represent the destructive nature of repression. How, sooner or later, it will cause you to violently destroy your life, your loved ones, and everything else you can get your hands on. Vanya's repressed mental and emotional state is surrounded and encouraged by the constant feeling of being invisible and small by a family that has also been subconsciously taught to treat her as inferior. This is what ultimately leads her to finally snapping and lashing out at the people that are supposed to love and care about her. In fact, the apocalypse itself, you can argue, is a metaphor for the destruction that abuse and neglect from your family can ultimately lead to. It's not just the destruction of the world that's at stake, but also the destruction of their very identities, as the death of the man that caused them all this pain leaves them in a place where they have all this damage caused by their upbringing and nowhere to put it. And more importantly, no one alive they can actively blame. All they're left with is each other, and it's made pretty clear from the get-go that this family has no idea how to be one, or how to support each other through their trauma. So now that they don't have a family to lash out at anymore, they lash out at each other, making it clearer and clearer not only that they don't know what to do with their burdens, but how little they actually know about each other at all. Because they've had no reason to get to know one another. From the very beginning, their entire lives and their entire identities have been wrapped around their father, and everything they are and everything they do, whether it's actively rebel or end up in their own destructive marriage, is a direct response to their father's actions. The only member that seems to have been able to successfully break free from their father's influence and build his own identity is, again, the one you'd least suspect, Klaus. While saying Klaus may not have the best coping mechanisms in the world is a bit of an understatement, he's also the only one that is ultimately not tied down in any significant way by their childhood. If anything, he's shockingly the closest one to self-actualization, able to recognize the damage that Hargreaves caused in life, but also not allowing that damage to affect his happiness or sense of self. He's the only one that seems actively content to be exactly who he is, and I don't think it's a coincidence that he's the one that ultimately ends up saving the day. Twice, technically. The first when he's able to replicate their father so perfectly that he convinces everyone he was actually able to summon him, proving his knowledge and understanding of who their father was and the manipulation tactics he would frequently employ. He's able to embody him mind, body, and soul, but also remain detached and unaffected by doing so. Klaus understands that his father played the role he played in his life, but he can choose to play his role however he wants. The stopping of the moon rock also says something about how his perception on his life and his personal movement towards self-actualization ends up saving his family from their own self-destructive means. If we're assuming that the apocalypse is a metaphor for the destruction abuse can cause, then the meteor, we can argue, is representative of, in Vanya's words, the finale, where all the damage and pain caused by the abusive upbringing comes crashing down and causes the family to destroy each other and themselves. By successfully stopping the meteor, Klaus demonstrates his ability to finally break the cycle of dysfunction, to finally silence all the loud voices all seeking validation from an ungrateful and cold father figure, by being the only one aware enough to be able to actually say or do something none of the others are capable of. And that is to show that moving on from the pain of an abusive childhood is possible, albeit extremely difficult. By stopping the meteor with a palm with the word hello tattooed on, he successfully manages to say goodbye to a life ruled by a man who only cared for his children so long as they're useful, and hello to a new life where they are free to move on and create their own identities. Not that the book says that this is an immediate or embraced option, mind you. In fact, once the dust settles, none of the other members seem to know what to do with that knowledge. What do you do with years of unresolved issues? Gerard Way doesn't pretend to have an easy answer for that, because there isn't one. But it can start with finally, after years of taking orders or deliberately rebelling against them, to finally make decisions that are totally and unequivocally yours. To create a start, no matter how big or small, to begin your life free from the parental chains that have kept you prisoner for so long. And in Luther's case, that path starts with the basics. The small acts that, with any luck, will build upon themselves into something greater, by simply making a sandwich. Will all of them be able to move past their trauma and learn how to redefine themselves? Maybe. Way leaves the answer to that deliberately unclear. And maybe ultimately, none of them ever truly can or will. But for this brief moment at the very least, the Umbrella Academy is allowed a reprieve from their father and his purpose for them. Abuse is a complicated subject, to put it lightly, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend to tell any of you how to cope with it or how to move past it, because how it affects its victims is based entirely on the individual affected. I'm not going to pretend to understand the pain and trauma that any of you watching has gone through in your life as a result of your past. But I do know that it's possible to heal, no matter how impossible it may seem. There's no clear-cut answer how, and there probably never will be, but I'm convinced it's possible. Because while we're all tied to our past and our upbringing in some way or another, we can grow beyond how we were raised. We can build our own identities outside of our family. We can recognize our own worth and value by learning what makes us special, because we all have something special about us, no matter what anyone says to try to belittle us or make us feel small. We all have something to give back to the world, and we all have a gift to share. And if we can find that and hold it tight, maybe we can all move past our pain and our anguish, and allow ourselves to say hello to a future free from it all.